Good morning, everybody. What a glorious day it is. My name is Martin Bunton. It's a real pleasure today to be able to chair today's talk, asked to fill in for Oliver Schmidtke, the director of the center. We'll start with, of course, the land acknowledgement, acknowledging with respect that the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I was thinking that this land acknowledgement will be particularly relevant, I think, with today's talk on popular movements and popular struggles. But then I think how often that is the case with the Center for Global Studies, that there is a real and significant link between these acknowledgements and the subjects. And I think that says a lot about the achievement of the center. Today's presenter is probably quite well known to you, Michael Carpenter. Michael, I think we just, as we just discussed, first came to the center as a graduate fellow in 2014. And has achieved so much since then, right? Including becoming a father, including completing a PhD under the supervision of Scott Watson and Jim Tully, including having his hardback edition of his book, Palestinian Popular Struggle, Unarmed and Participatory, being published, and now moving into paperback. So we have an opportunity here to hear from Michael. We're framing it in part as a paperback book launch. And so co-hosting this with the Middle East Discussion Group. So it's an interesting opportunity to both think about his book project, but also an opportunity for him to reflect back on quite a busy few years since the publication of his book. So an opportunity to reflect on an impressive achievement a few years after, and to reflect on all that has happened since then. Michael continues to be with the center. He's works with the Borders in Globalization project and edits the journal of that project. He has taught in political science. He has very generously continued to be the coordinator of the Middle East Discussion Group. And it is a real pleasure to be able to welcome Michael and hand things over to you. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. It was great to see you all in the preamble to this, everybody. I look forward to some good discussion after. And today what I'm going to do, as Martin said, is I'm kind of going to look back on some of the major themes of the book and also share a few Palestinian voices. I also want to share my screen. Oh, let's see. This should work. Okay. Specifically, what I want to do is try to sketch out the two main claims of the book. One claim about action and one claim about organization. And those two claims are bound up here in unarmed action and participatory organization. And I want to suggest that this is important stuff and continues to be important stuff because it seems like everywhere around the world, popular politics is on the rise. What do we mean by popular politics? We're talking about politics that are not confined to conventional institutions or formal channels, though it can sometimes work within those as well. Popular politics is community-based, grassroots, in the streets, in the fields, online. It's sometimes called contentious politics or civil resistance or civil disobedience. Think social movements, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, indigenous resurgence. It can include and should include labor organizing and work strikes. But the key to popular politics is that it's ordinary people waging struggle, and generally outside of formal state institutions. For many people, popular politics kind of entered the consciousness 10 years ago in 2011 with the Arab Spring and then with Occupy Wall Street. But by most accounts, 2019 was witnessed even more protest around the world, with popular uprisings in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, South America. And then in 2020, popular politics took center stage right here in North America. Remember, as last week, as Keith talked about, 1 year ago, Canada was in the grips of civil disobedience. Protesters and barricades shut down BC ferries, blockaded highways and rail lines across the country. That was high stakes political showdown. And I've often wondered since how it might have played out had the coronavirus not intervened. Then, of course, in the US over the summer, there was that massive outpouring of protests in most American cities, which lasted for weeks, over police brutality. And in terms of numbers, actually, those were the largest protests in US history. And finally, just last month, of course, we saw that display of protests taken to a new level with the storming of the US Capitol. So I'm saying we need to definitely keep our conversations going about how popular struggle works. And we need to stay in dialogue with those on the ground and be prepared to recognize the expertise of the local. So in short, to summarize my little intro here, for anyone interested in politics these days, including policymakers, educators, activists, organizers, researchers, we have a vested interest in better understanding how popular struggle works, and this is my one small contribution to that conversation. So I am excited and grateful that the paperback release of the book gives me the opportunity to do this. And just one final disclaimer, though I do try to learn from Palestinian experience, and I try to bring in some Palestinian voices and perspectives, the arguments here are my arguments. I'm responsible for them in their expression and their framing, and any confusions or mistakes are certainly my own. And I certainly also don't speak for anyone else. And let me take this opportunity now to plug an event next month. This will be the third in a row of the Middle East Discussion Group Book Talks. We had Hani Hilmi's a couple months back. We have mine today. And in this one, Dr. Abdelhadi El-Ijla, I apologize if I'm getting the vowels wrong on that, has graciously agreed to come and talk to us about his 2021 book, Trust in Divided Societies, State, Institutions, and Governance in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. So that promises to be very informative. I learned about his work because he had made a submission to the journal that I edit, and I invited him to join the Middle East Discussion Group to present on his book. And so this is being set up for March 16th. Anyone curious, watch for the email notices that will come out soon or contact me to get more information. I want to express a little bit of gratitude right here. Thank you, Center for Global Studies, for co-hosting this event. As Martin said, most of the dissertation that became the book was written while I was a graduate fellow at the center, and I continue to be there through my capacities with Borders and Globalization, where I manage the open access journal, Borders and Globalization Review. No one could ask for a better work community, and I miss it, especially in these basement days where I had to go get a jacket because it's a little bit chilly. I'm grateful also to Routledge for publishing this work. And so I was really excited to promote the sale of the book, which was discounted down to $36 for the paperback. But I see now that it's back up to its regular price of $50. Or you could get the hardcover for a mere $150. It's meant for libraries. Obviously, there are advantages to publishing with big name publishers, the academic presses, but sometimes I wonder if I should have held out for a publisher with a more marketable price just to extend the general public reach of the book, or maybe even pursued something open access. I'm not sure, but I can say that Routledge has been really good to me, and I'm grateful for that. And I want to echo what Martin said at the beginning about the gratitude on the land here. I do respectfully acknowledge that this part of this beautiful island off the west coast of Turtle Island is Lekwungen territory, and that the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples' historical relationships to the land continue today. And it's sentiments like this that led me last year to speak out last winter when police forces were used to remove Wet'suwet'en people from their land for the development of the pipeline project under conditions of very questionable government authority. I don't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that system because I'm a product of that system. This is the system that has shielded me and given me opportunities simply because I was born a European settler. And of course, colonialism here is connected to colonialism over there. And as a Canadian, I'm incredibly privileged and fortunate. I can get on a plane, travel to the Middle East, walk around the West Bank and Jerusalem, wave my passport to clear any of 100 Israeli checkpoints, come and go, fly home. And that means that as a Canadian citizen, I have more rights in Palestine than Palestinians. Because Palestinians living under Israeli occupation have no such rights. Many can't even travel 10 kilometers to visit Jerusalem or go swimming in the sea, let alone travel internationally, because they are among the 4 or 5 million people subject to Israeli military rule. Remember that Palestinians under occupation are stateless. They're citizens of nowhere. They have no citizenship rights. The Israeli military controls their lives, controls their movement, their land development, their resources, infrastructure, ID system, birth registries, taxes, and on and on. Yet Palestinians under occupation can't vote in Israeli elections or access Israeli courts. It's perpetual martial law, generation after generation. And it's important to point out that the so-called Palestinian Authority is really no authority at all. It basically amounts to glorified and scattered pockets of municipal style governance. It's really no real power. And of course, in Palestine, it's not just colonialism, but colonization. In the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Palestinians are being squeezed off what little land remains to them, and Israel is still building Jewish-only settlements around them. Whatever you think about Palestinian leadership, now or in the past, this is collective punishment, and it's wrong. I know it can be difficult to talk about this stuff, but I think we have to. Canada is not a neutral party to this. Our government calls Israel one of our closest allies in the world, and the Canadian government provides unwavering and uncritical support, diplomatic support. Did you know, for example, that at the UN General Assembly, for more than 10 years, under both the conservative Stephen Harper government and the liberal Justin Trudeau government, Canada consistently voted against a Palestinian state as part of the two-state solution, even though Canada's official foreign policy is to support a two-state solution. So how do you square that circle? But I know it's not easy to speak out, and it makes people uncomfortable. And I think sometimes it leads to self-censorship, and other times I think it leads to actual censorship. And as a believer in free speech, I want to recognize that today Palestinians and their supporters are being silenced more than usual by big institutions, by the tech giants, social media giants, under the banner of stopping hate speech. But of course, criticizing Israel for its domination of the Palestinian people or speaking out for Palestinian rights is not anti-Semitic or hate speech. And neither is supporting the Palestinian boycott movement against Israel, even though our government and our prime minister have said otherwise. And we could talk more about Canada's anti-Palestinian record later on if you want to bring that up in discussion. So This is how the next 45 minutes or so will go. We've already done the acknowledgements. So next we'll turn to a quick overview of the book with a few quotes. And don't worry, not my quotes. And then I want to zero in on a couple of the key conceptual arguments of the book. The first claim deals with action. Yes, civil resistance is mostly nonviolent, but I argue not always or necessarily nonviolent. Because in some contexts, some forms of what many would call violence actually functions as constructive civil resistance. And the second claim, related, direct democratic movements are mostly horizontal, but not always or necessarily horizontal. Because especially at larger scales, participatory organization requires some vertical or centralized elements. And these can actually take forms that preserve the radical democratic quality of a movement. And finally, I want to try and quickly elaborate why there are some lessons here that I think have importance beyond Palestine. And then I get to hear from you. So hopefully at about 45 minutes, if I go over, Stephanie should feel free to cut my mic, or maybe not, but we'll see how it goes. So the book recounts and analyzes action and organization in Palestinian popular struggle, which I argue partly reinforces and partly challenges common notions of nonviolent civil resistance and horizontal movement structure. And these are the two arguments, the one about unarmed action and participatory organization, that I want to focus on. I also want to say I tried to write the book in a way that would be accessible to anyone with an interest in the region or in these kinds of ideas. But I should also add, if you're a big theory person, go to the dissertation, because honestly, the publisher wanted a little bit more action and a little bit less theory about action. Moving on, the book, what is the book made up of? The book contains an important historical case study. The First Intifada, or the Intifada of the Stones, was a non-militarized mass popular uprising in the occupied territories that began in 1987, and actually it continued for a number of years into the early 90s. Intifada means uprising in Arabic. Stone throwing was common, as you might have intuited, but the First Intifada was also marked by broad-based participation in classic civil disobedience methods, peaceful demonstrations, boycott campaigns, labor strikes, and alternative institution building, including radically democratic, community-based organizing that was both horizontal, but also contained vertical or centralized elements that I'll talk about a little bit more. This First Intifada is often recognized as probably the most effective phase of Palestinian struggle to date. It generated some of the most sympathetic international attention and support and political momentum towards actually ending the occupation and achieving Palestinian independence. But in the end, of course, it wasn't quite enough. We could talk about some of the reasons why it wasn't ultimately successful. But I argue that stone throwing in that uprising was not a detriment to the movement, but an asset. It was that image of youth hurling stones at an occupying power that helped bring this Palestinian struggle into the homes of people around the world through the front pages of newspapers, on nightly news broadcasts. There was a kind of reversal of the conventional notion of David and Goliath. Here, the Jewish state had become Goliath and the Palestinians David. So in this context, the stone throwing actually seems to have bolstered some of the momentum and reception of the movement. And just to make that point a little more clear, it's often contrasted with the Second Intifada of 2000, which was an armed or very militarized movement and ultimately less effective, even counterproductive by most accounts. In the end, the Second Intifada has left the occupation more entrenched than ever, and the Palestinians more isolated than ever. So this chapter is one chapter in the book. It covers a cornerstone of Palestinian struggle and shows how the First Intifada exemplifies the claims I want to make about unarmed action and participatory organization. Plus, many activists in the West Bank today that I spoke with, they frequently hearken back to the First Intifada as a kind of lost golden age of resistance. Now, most of the book focuses on more recent popular struggle in the West Bank. It involves field research, 3 months of field research into contemporary, what we might call hotspots of popular protest in the West Bank, especially the resistance villages of Bilayin and Nabi Saleh, and along portions of the separation barrier, and a tactic of land defense camps. And this research was based off of participant observation. I attended 10 weekly Friday demonstrations and a number of other protests and events. I did 200 questionnaires with the general public, random samples, and I did 25 hours of interviews with activists organizing and participating in the popular struggle, or people in the near periphery of it. And this is 4 chapters of the book. The book also has an introduction and a conclusion and appendices. Now, what does Palestinian popular struggle look like? You probably all have a sense of what this looks like, but these are pictures that I took in the West Bank. It should give you a sense of kind of the character or the flavor of this. You see men, women, and children. And I know that the topic of Israel-Palestine can be depressing for a lot of people, but when you're on the ground, you can really get caught up in these pockets of hope and excitement. Where there's popular struggle, you will see proud, smiling, laughing faces. And there's a real sense of community and camaraderie, and even sometimes a kind of revolutionary euphoria. And some of these local movements and campaigns have been relatively effective. Of course, none of them have ended the occupation or brought about a Palestinian state, but at the micro level, the local level, there have been significant achievements, little victories resulting in tangible gains for actual communities, reclaiming portions of lost land, removing segments of the separation barrier, bringing in international and transnational support as witnesses and friends from around the world. And what the book does is try to explore the interplay between action and organization in contributing to some of these local successes. But I don't want to overstate it. What you see here is not a mass movement. It's nothing like the First Intifada. It's small, it's fractured, compartmentalized, mostly confined to the rural areas, and it's been dwindling in numbers in recent years. And we can talk about some of the reasons for that if you want. Small victories, but important victories, I argue. I'll give my voice a break. Let's listen to a couple snippets of interview. I've got about 10 minutes in total. First, I asked all of my interview participants, what does popular struggle mean to you? And this is one response. Hopefully you can hear.
Well, I believe the popular struggle is basically anything that is being agreed on from the people on the ground and people who work on the grassroots level. So if the grassroots level of people is agreeing to having resistance in the form of protests, then that's popular struggle. If it's in forms of boycotting the occupation, that's also popular struggle. Blocking roads, any types of action that are basically from the people themselves who live under occupation, that's popular struggle. And I believe that for us Palestinians, when we talk about popular struggle, it includes everybody that works on the ground, whether it's political parties, whether it's individuals, whether it's people who are independent and are not part of any political parties or organizations, all of that includes popular struggle to us.
And for pages and pages of different activists talking about what popular struggle means to them, check out the book. Here I ask a popular committee member about the logic of who gets to be in the popular committees. The popular resistance committees are the primary units of action. They plan and lead the demonstrations. They deal with the press, the international supporters. They coordinate with other popular committees from other communities. And in this clip, a founding member of the Bil'in Popular Committee, which is probably the most successful and famous of the popular committees today, in terms of its achievements on the ground, building international support and having small victories. He talks about the makeup of the popular committees, sort of the membership principle of constituting the popular committees.
It's what we mean to when we spoke about popular committees or popular resistance, we need all of the people to be with us. For this, when we want to choose the leaders of the popular committees, we must put in our mind why we want to choose A or B or C. For this, we try to take from the parties. From the party in Palestine, what's the parties here in Bil'in? Fatah, Hamas, Popular Front, for example. These people we took from one member from all of the parties. One. Another thing we have the organization like youth club. You know, the youth clubs in the village. We can choose one member from the youth because we have a big number of people in the club. Also, we have the one of the organization is the council of the village. We have a council, a municipality of the village. We can talk them. Also, in addition to that, we can choose the independents, the famous people, the people who they have the character to be a leader in this action. Also, we have in the village the families. You know, we have 5 families here. We try to choose one from every family. We make this cocktail from all of these people to be all of that village representative in the committee. And I think, as you say, it's the same in the first Intifada. They try to take the parties, the health organization, the students, the women organization. Also, we have a women in our village organization. For this year, we choose the same. We put in our minds if this person they have a power to be with us. 50 or 100%, we will, and after that, we will open the committee. It's not closed. We told our committee, it's open. Anyone who want to be member in it, he will come. But we put in the minds of the people to be member in the committee. It's mean to be the first one in the action and the last one who leave the action. It's not to come to take photos or to make meetings or to be a member from behind your office and to tell the people go there or go there. When you speak about popular resistance, it means to be in the field, to be with the people, to suffer like the same suffering of the people. As I told, today I am injured and also more than 100, 200 arrested. And for my case, they arrested me in the action 4 times.
So that gives a sense of the main organizational units of popular resistance in Palestine and Palestinian tradition. These popular committees of all forms really characterized the first Intifada in the entire occupied territories. Popular resistance committees, health, medical, education, in addition to labor organizing, whereas today the popular committees are a little bit more, a lot more few and far between, and as I said, mostly confined to the rural areas, but the principle is the same. I also want to include here a few more women's voices, and this is a bit of a mashup of 2 different women talking about the role of women as women in popular struggle. and the extent of leadership or frontline roles that women can play. As it says here, despite social pressures and disadvantages, women have historically been leaders of popular struggle in the occupied territories, continuing today. Here we go. Should play. And asked about her experience with the popular resistance and particular actions, a young Palestinian based in Ramallah introduces gender into the discussion.
Well, as a woman, specifically in popular resistance, we're always fighting two ways. You know, we're fighting the patriarchy as well as the occupation. Well, most cases, women, if you've seen popular struggle, and specific Nabi Saleh, it's women that are usually in the front lines, and that is also a form of them fighting patriarchy, and that's what popular resistance gives for women. It gives them the ability to be in the front lines and fight patriarchy at the same time fighting colonization.
Commemorating International Women's Day, Ramallah youth activists were among the hundreds of women marching in solidarity on a checkpoint, the major checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem.
For instance, when it was International Women's Day, where women went on Qalandia checkpoint, and we all gathered all the way to the front of the checkpoint. We were skunked, we were attacked with tear gas canisters being shot directly at us. We had some women, you know, suffocation cases, injuries on the head, and, you know, fractured arms, etc.
In a very audacious direct action by the Popular Resistance Committees, 20 women stormed a military base and occupied its rooftop twice in a 12-hour period, leading to frantic media scenes and several arrests.
We were a group of 20 women. We went to Beit El settlement, to the military base. We took over the roof of the settlement, the military base, and soldiers, they were like shot, then they were screaming, closing the window. There were, I think, 4 or 5 women from Jerusalem, some from Ramallah, 9 actually from Nabi Saleh. And also there were men with us, but they still, we took over the roof.
So that gives a sense of some of the prominence and even audacity of the role of women in some aspects of popular struggle. Of course, we're talking about a conservative society, so it is still very patriarchal, and much of this is happening in the rural areas. So while popular struggle can be empowering for women, they also face this double burden, right, of struggling against the occupation and against these traditional patriarchal structures. Now, in this last clip I want to play, it's about 5 minutes. This is a wide-ranging discussion of popular resistance strategy, and I'm mostly going to let it speak for itself. We won't be able, unfortunately, to unpack it all, but a lot of it should be quite eye-opening and illuminating to you. And watch for a very unexpected cameo late in the clip. This is a Palestinian organizer from the village of Nabi Saleh discussing the strategy of popular struggle.
I told you, we mean by popular struggle unarmed struggle. The international law gives us as under occupation the right to resist an enemy. But which mean we choose, it's our decision. We have the right, but what is suitable mean is our decision to use. In our historical period of time, when we decide to build the Saleh model, yeah, we are a group from First Intifada middle leader. Yeah, we start talking about the strategy and what's the best answer for the Palestinian issue question. That after this happened, we are a group not from Nabi Saleh, also from other places in Palestine, and we start discuss what is the suitable answer for our question and what's the suitable mean for our issue. And after we evaluate the second intifada and our experience from the first intifada, and we also read our history, we see that in 2 periods of time, we become near to succeed in our historical revolution, 1936, 1987. The 2 periods of time, we use the popular struggle. This means it succeeded, and it can succeed. Also, we see that the villages that use this mean to protect their land, Because of the wall, they partially succeed to protect part of their land. This means it's useful for our issue. Also, we read the model in the international model, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Mandela, and other kind of model that succeed all around the world. This means it may be suitable for our issue. For that, we decide to build the strategy and to make other alternative for our society to choose, because we believe that after the second intifada and after December 11 and after the war against the terrorists all over the world, and Israel and take part of our act and our mistake of the suicide bombing to make a cause and make a link between our legal resistance and the terrorists around the world, which harm the image of the Palestinian in the international community mentality. For that, we start to discuss what is the suitable mean. We decide to choose this mean. It's the popular thing. We don't want to name it non-violent or peace or what. We want it part from our culture to be more acceptable. And I told you, our vision is the first intifada. The symbol of the first intifada is stone. Yeah. If we talk about non-violent, it's mean that if a child hold a stone, it will be unacceptable. We want to build our model from our culture.
So I'll just pause it there and emphasize this point that he's making. He's giving a reason why the discourse of nonviolence is not necessarily suited to Palestinian civil resistance. It frames this very traditional and popular practice of throwing stones at occupying forces as violent and therefore presumably illegitimate. It separates the practice of stone throwing from other forms of popular struggle, and it casts it as part of the problem. When in reality, I think, and I argue in the book, it actually functions as civil resistance in the way that its logic plays out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So what's happening here is many of these activists are rejecting armed struggle or militarized struggle because they don't think it's appropriate for their cause. But at the same time, they're also rejecting the discourse of nonviolence as well. Let me carry on with the rest of this clip.
Also, the human right believer and the freedom fighter must make a globalization for their belief and their moral issue and their thought. And because of that, we said that you see that South Africa's solution comes from the pressure from outside pressure. This means, for me, the third intifada must be global. And we choose the popular struggle as a strategy to give an opportunity for everyone in the world to do his duty and his responsibility. For us, as a Palestinian, we become a victim of the victim after the international community wake up after the Holocaust criminal against the humanity and solve the problem from our account and on our land. They bring the Jewish refugees and put them in our land and become the victim of the victim. For that, you have your duty and your responsibility for us. You can't be free if I lose my freedom. And I lose my freedom and my land because of your policy and your government policy. For that, when you told me that your prime minister sing for Netanyahu, it's mean we share the same enemy. Yeah, we have the same enemy. It's the interest of the capitalism. Who harm the environment and who harm the human being.
We have the same enemy. It's the interests of the capitalists who harm the environment and who harm the human being. Okay, there's way too much in those clips for me to unpack, but hopefully that has piqued some of your interest. And all of this is elaborated in the book. Now I want to zero in on our two particular conceptual claims about action and organization. Specifically, the first, that civil resistance is mostly nonviolent, but not always that maybe unarmed or non-militarized is a better category for understanding what's happening on the ground in a lot of popular struggles. And I think to appreciate this more nuanced position, we need to start, or we need to situate it within the prevailing wisdom of civil resistance studies. This on this slide, what I've done is condense the standard view of civil resistance, a very low resolution. Let's review it point by point, and then I'll emphasize where what I'm saying diverges or differs from this. Civil resistance theory explores methods of nonviolent action as effective alternatives to violence in conflict. So the first thing that we need to get over in understanding how civil resistance works is it's not passive. It is a form of combat. It is meant as a way to wage conflict. This is how it's studied and been understood for 100 years, going back to Gandhi and really the first generation of civil resistance studies. It's grown in recent years. It was mostly a very small body of literature, but in recent years, in fact, some very large N studies have shown that the efficacy of nonviolent movements or civil resistance is not only comparable to violent or armed movements, but actually superior. Looking at case studies from around the world over 100 years, including against dictatorships and in liberation struggles and against occupations. The study of civil resistance emphasizes nonviolent methods as the key to this power, because nonviolent methods maximize conditions for support and participation, minimize the risk that action will backfire, and increase the likelihood that regime crackdowns will backfire. What are we saying here? Nonviolent methods maximize conditions for support and participation because these methods are freely available to everyone. This builds on the major capital of any movement, which is the power of numbers. How many people can you get out? And nonviolent strategies open the door for maximizing support and participation. They also minimize the risk that action will backfire. So even if an action is unsuccessful, nothing's been destroyed and nobody gets seriously harmed or killed. So there's less risk of potentially alienating some of your supporters or potential supporters. And the flip side of this, of course, the corollary of this claim is that violent methods or militarized methods carry a higher risk of backfiring, partly because it can alienate or deter some people from your own population, your own base of support. As far as third parties go, violent action can turn off it can make it more difficult for third parties to support a movement. And violent resistance also tends to consolidate the support of the regime. It tends to, governments or societies will rally the wagons in the face of a security threat, right? And in terms of this first point, maximizing conditions for support, the flip side of that is that violent methods actually raise barriers to support and participation. Violent militarized methods raise logistical barriers for people to participate, moral or ethical barriers, physical barriers, technological barriers. And nonviolent methods increase the likelihood that regime crackdowns will backfire, because the optics couldn't be more clear when you see police brutality or state brutality against nonviolent protesters. And so it's much more likely that that action by the state will then backfire. That means that it will potentially actually flare up opposition. It will potentially outrage the resistance population to be more determined. These sorts of violent crackdowns against nonviolent movements can also isolate a regime internationally or generate third-party support for the resistance. And even in egregious regime crackdowns, you can see defections from the state group to the movement. You'll see, in the Egyptian Spring, this was a great example, when the army actually sided with the protesters, or appeared at the time to side with the protesters in Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring. And it's hard to imagine that that could have possibly happened if the tactics of the Egyptian people at that time had been, an armed uprising, blowing things up and killing people. So on these terms, this is sort of the main set of ideas how civil resistance scholars understand that nonviolent methods can actually counterintuitively be more effective than violent methods, even in high conflict situations. And I think this is mostly right. This is what I've been studying for a long time, and it's very compelling, but there's a couple of problems with it. And I think the main concern here is that the standard of nonviolent action precludes or prejudges otherwise effective and legitimate forms of action that may happen to include minimal or relatively minuscule levels of violence. So as I say here, the emphasis on nonviolent action is often implicitly or explicitly binary, either violent or nonviolent. So any action, even minimally violent, is lumped in with guns and bombs. And in some contexts, this is just bad analysis. This goes back to what the activist from Nebi Saleh was saying, that Palestinian stone throwing does not fit comfortably here in the rhetoric of nonviolence. But to make this point, let me start with a few easier, more familiar examples of exceptions to the rule of nonviolent civil resistance. These three examples come from Robin Kellicotti's work, though he didn't use all these pictures, and I'm modifying it a little bit. Self-harm, hunger strikes, self-immolation, property destruction, or the limited use of force in self-defense. So Kellicotti's is saying, what Kellicotti's as a scholar of civil disobedience is doing is he's breaking with the pervasive idea in the research literature that civil disobedience is always or necessarily nonviolent. Hey, we already recognize hunger strikes as a legitimate part of the repertoire of civil disobedience. Gandhi was famous for undertaking hunger strikes. Okay, maybe that's an easy exception because it's not extending harm to someone else. But many people also recognize that property destruction in some contexts can function as civil resistance. It doesn't smack of military struggle. It doesn't smack of armed tactics. And the most sort of difficult example that Kellicotti's gets into, limited force and self-defense, is maybe a little bit trickier, but in cases of high conflict or conflict-prone situation or conditions of severe repression, then this kind of pushback against regime forces can often play out like civil resistance. What does that mean? It means that it's not likely to backfire as an armed struggle would. It means that it doesn't close doors to participation, and it means that it still creates the optics or the dynamics or the imbalance between the extreme violence of the regime and the relatively minuscule violence of the protests. So the point here is not all civil resistance is nonviolent. And we need to understand, as Kellicotti's argues, that the civil in civil resistance or civil disobedience doesn't mean passive or civility or very polite. It means civilian. It means, this is why I use the term popular struggle. So, of course, then I'm trying to extend this logic to Palestinian stone throwing. This is undertaken by civilians. It's non-state protest. It's non-militarized. It still fosters popular participation, still carries a low risk of backfiring, as I argue, still casts the state crackdowns as disproportionate. And so we're in the domain of unarmed popular struggle. The concept of nonviolent resistance is close, but not quite right for this or many cases of actual struggle today. This the second claim I want to do, hopefully we'll go through it a little bit quicker. I'm mindful of the time. First of all, just as we did with nonviolent civil resistance, let's just quickly reflect on the standard view of horizontal organizing. Horizontal organizing is, what is it? It's radically democratic. It means open to all. It means direct participation. And typically, horizontalist approaches to movement organization exhibit a preference for decision-making by unanimous consent. Think about the assembly and generating total consent among the body. There's also an aversion to majority votes and representation, which are understood as flawed or imperfect practices of democracy. And there's a tendency to regard all centralization and verticality as inherently authoritarian, a tendency to reject all forms of hierarchy as authoritarian by definition. Now, I'm very sympathetic to horizontal organizing, and I think it's mostly right, but it's not quite right. Just like it's wrong to say that all civil resistance is or should be nonviolent, I think it's wrong to say that all radically democratic organizing must be strictly or exclusively horizontal. Because, we'll go through these points one by one, not all hierarchies are dominative, if their processes and relations are bottom up and not top down. Organizing requires centralization or verticality to scale up beyond localities. And this focus on the discourse of horizontalism has been criticized as being too exclusively lateral. And there's a few sources that I engage with. Popular committees can be networked horizontally, and they mostly are horizontal organizations, but they can also be tiered vertically through upward delegation, steering committees, umbrella organizations, etc., that don't fit the standard of horizontalist. To give a couple of probably overly simplistic visuals here we have two organizational units. Maybe they're two popular committees, two assemblies, two councils of some sort. It's very easy for them to coordinate and collaborate horizontally. It's small scale. But as you multiply the number of units, that becomes increasingly difficult. You can see any unit can have a horizontal coordination with those in its proximity or periphery, but as this multiplies and multiplies and multiplies, it becomes increasingly difficult for a collection of organizational units to act in unison, to make collective decisions, to coordinate what they're doing. And of course, in the modern world, the response to this problem is the sovereign state, right? That classic top-down pyramidal dominator hierarchy in which the directional arrows of decision-making and control are all downward from the top. Of course, this is an overly simplified model because modern states also do have democratic aspects built-in, institutions built into them, whether it's elections or parliaments. But this is an ideal type of what the state is in essence. Think about the absolute monarchy. So this is the sovereign state model, which resolves the problem of how to coordinate at scale, but participatory organization can take this sort of pyramidal or hierarchical shape, but crucially the directional arrows, the processes of decision-making and participation are all either lateral or upward. And again, this is a simplified model. The reality of a structured popular organization like this would be much looser and messier. It wouldn't be a single formal structure, but a plurality of shifting and contingent delegations of authority upward. And each ascending level is some kind of steering committee or umbrella organization, usually consolidating regions or issue areas. And to be participatory, each level has to remain accountable directly to its level or the level it arises from, not once every 4 years by casting a single vote, but through continuous engagement, deliberation, consensus building, and voting practices. This is what the organization of the First Intifada looked like in the 1980s, and I argue that this was part of its major power at the time, which has not been matched before or since in Palestinian struggle. Now, I'm not suggesting that this model of organization is perfect or without flaws. First of all, it's a lot of work for a lot of people. It's very time consuming. And second, it depends on a very high degree of trust in society. So it's not perfect, but it offers an alternative to democratic organizing that can overcome some of the limitations inherent in horizontalist models. I haven't seen too many arguments like this in the research literature. Organization is neglected in civil resistance studies, but probably my favorite theorist on this topic is Hannah Arendt. It's not usually what she's known for, but she has really inspired me to think about this in her book on revolution. You can find this kind of model of organizing in a few other places, in some anarchist and socialist traditions. I'm thinking specifically about Murray Bookchin and his approach to confederalism. It's kind of in practice, we might say, in Kurdish Rojava in northern Syria right now. Let me just quickly end with a couple of Hannah Arendt quotes on participatory organization. I want to just quickly, if I can, flesh out what Hannah Arendt said on this in her book on revolutions. And she shows in this book that the same pattern of participatory organization in the form of networked and tiered grassroots committees or councils has recurred spontaneously in many historical uprisings and revolutions. For example, she draws parallels between the American town hall model in the years leading up to the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson's ward system of elementary republics, the Paris Commune of 1871, the 1905 and 1917 Russian workers' councils or Soviets, the German Rat system or council system that spread across Germany during the November Revolution of 1918, and the social committees that appeared across Hungary during the mass uprising of 1956. And she calls these organs of the people, organs of action, popular organs, organs of order. And for Arendt, of course, this is not just horizontal, it's vertical as well. The formation of higher councils of regional or provincial character from which finally the delegates to an assembly representing the whole country could be chosen. I'm sorry to rush through a little bit of this, but here in this quote, she's acknowledging, I'll read the quote in just a moment, she's acknowledging that the shape of the model may superficially resemble a dominator hierarchy, but in process, it's very different. They are democratic hierarchies. It's all about the direction of those arrows that we talked about. So she says, no doubt, this form of government, if fully developed, would have assumed again the shape of a pyramid, which is, of course, the shape of an essentially authoritarian government. But while in all authoritarian government we know of, authority is filtered down from above. In this case, authority would have been generated on each of the pyramid's layers. And I don't think this is just a semantic argument. There's something qualitatively different about this. And she says, historians and analysts have failed to understand to what extent the council system confronted them with an entirely new form of government, with a new public space for freedom, which was constituted and organized during the course of the revolution itself. So this is what I think is a bit of a corrective or an antidote to a lot of the discourse today on horizontalist organizing. And I think I can wrap this up in 2 or 3 minutes with my conclusion here, and then hear from some of you. I think there's a couple comments in the chat. I haven't been able to see them yet. So what? What is the point of all this? Popular struggle is, I'm arguing, mostly but not exclusively nonviolent, hence the term unarmed. And it's mostly but not exclusively horizontal, more precisely participatory. So with the term popular struggle, if we understand it as unarmed and participatory, we can kind of sidestep some of the baggage or the exclusions that come with the discourse of nonviolent action and with the discourse of horizontal organization. For example, in this framing, the Palestinian stone throwing can be read not as an exception to or a spoiler of their civil resistance. It's just not nonviolent. It's mostly nonviolent, but it functions as civil resistance. And I think that moving away from a discourse of nonviolence in some contexts can help shield protesters from being labeled or smeared as violent by the state, which can empower state crackdowns. To label a movement nonviolent, you can activate the security state, not just in Palestine, but anywhere. So this framing resolves contradictions and confusions surrounding notions of action and organization, as I say, not just in Palestine. And the example I want to give to try and drive this home is think about Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring. First, in Occupy Wall Street, it's been criticized for not having a bigger impact, for not cohering around a program or making a bigger difference. What might have happened if the organizers of Occupy had not been caught up on absolutist notions of horizontality, but began delegating upwards or running candidates or moving towards a national program? And I think it did very little of that because it was very much committed to its unanimous consent, unanimous consensus-based horizontal organizing. One of the great puzzles of the Arab Spring for many social scientists and activists alike was, how do you translate all that popular momentum into lasting institutional change? Well, might that problem have been easier to solve if the Egyptians in the street had been more willing to organize upward instead of insisting on sitting outside of politics? In other words, let's keep our imaginations open. Let's listen to and learn from movements on the ground in order to better understand and work with the logics of popular struggle. I think I've gone a little bit over time. Where is our chat? Okay, Martin.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much. We still have a good half hour, so thank you for that. You covered so much ground, Michael. Thank you for that. And it's a complex issue, isn't it? And it's a contentious, sensitive one. So I appreciate the introductory comments you made too. We already have a few questions in the chat. Some people had to leave a bit early. So I wonder, maybe everybody could allow me a quick observation, and then I think I'll turn to the chats and ask those questions. My first observation was simply to thank you for the local voices. You know, I think this is so very important. We're all aware of the sort of pitfalls of representation generally, perhaps even more with the Middle East. And I remember my supervisor would often talk about the need to at least try to paint a picture that is as recognizable to people on the ground as possible, at least, right? In terms of, so I think we always need to hear much more of the local voices. So I really appreciated that. I had a question around Berlin in 2014 as a case study, as opposed to something perhaps the extent to which perhaps those voices, did they emerge from 2014? Would you hear them today if you were to go there? And if Berlin does constitute a case study, would it be looked at, how would people today look back upon it as a success, you know, the way 37 and 87 were? And I think I can link that to the other two questions. Elizabeth was asking about if you could speak a bit more of the practices of Sumud and how that does factor in as popular resistance. You did briefly mention it at the outset, that Sumud as resistance or steadfastness, maybe, is of simply staying in place against the pressures of colonization. And then Abdel Hadi has asked about the Great March of Return and how that might factor in, again, into your discussion, perhaps as a case study, or I kept coming back to that because I wonder how case study, it's the historian in me, right? What do we do with case studies as ways of exploring this? But the two questions, one around Sumud and one around the Great March of Return, and I'll leave that to you. And then I'll ask others to note your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to you when there's time. Thank you to Keith for doing that. Michael.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for those questions. And I do apologize. I probably had a bit too much packed in there, but I hope it was ultimately intelligible. Mm-hmm. The great thing about case studies is you can define them. You can define when they start and you can define when they end, but these are often sliding scales and moving goalposts, right? Because if you were to just snapshot Egypt between 2011 and 2012, you would say, hey, wow, this is one of the most successful mass unarmed popular uprisings in history. Look at they overthrew a dictator of 30 years and first free and fair democratic elections. But you extend that time frame by a few years, you have to would now say it wasn't successful. What they have today is actually worse than they had before. Now, is that the fault of the movement? I wouldn't go that far. I think in the, there's never an ultimate end to politics or a happily ever after. It's a constant struggle. And in the end, it was defeated or outmaneuvered or however you want to put it. But I think the most important way to evaluate the efficacy or success of a case study is to say, what was the movement's goals? What did they articulate as their objective? The case study of the village of Bil'in, they never stated as their goal ending the occupation. They never stated as their goal achieving a Palestinian state. That's a big national question. They were much more modest in their goals. They said, we want this wall here moved off of the middle of our field. We want this wall to be off of our land. And after years of persistent organizing and demonstrating, lo and behold, the military one day dismantled the wall and moved it back off of where it had been, freeing up not massive amounts of land, but it made a real difference for this village. Farmers were able to access their fields again. So in terms of evaluating the efficacy, well, I want to focus on sort of little victories, and are they effective in achieving what they set out to do? And then the next question becomes, how can we begin to scale this up and set our benchmark targets higher and higher and higher? The Great March of Return is a very important question. And I am very regretful that I didn't even have time to mention Gaza in this presentation. And it's generally not the focus of my book because I was doing field research into the popular committees of the West Bank. But the Great March of Return is probably an amazing way to exemplify exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes when you see the way the Great March of Return was covered in the media, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, this was basically around 2018, the people of Gaza, starting out as a sort of a popular initiative by local committees and organizations on the ground, ultimately working with the political parties in Gaza, decided that they were going to, in a very public and visible way, march to the heavily militarized barrier around the Gaza Strip. And they bared brutal repression and tear gas and rubber-coated bullets and real bullets with snipers to do so. But it was Palestinian popular resistance. It wasn't non-violent resistance. You saw, lots of stone throwing, wire clippers trying to cut through the fence, putting small homemade incendiaries onto kites and flying them over the wall, hoping to burn some Israeli fields to make the cost of the blockade of Gaza a little bit more burdensome or onerous on Israel. And the way it was portrayed in the media gets to the heart of what I'm talking about, because so many discussions about the Great March of Return were derailed by trying to figure out, well, is it nonviolent or not? You can't call this a nonviolent movement. Look at all the violence, look at the stones. So we can sidestep all that if we remove a little bit in some contexts the emphasis on nonviolence and just accept that, look, the major dynamics of this are that it's non-militarized. We're not talking about, there were no Israelis killed in the months and months and months of the March of Return, and there were hundreds of Palestinians that were killed. This was unarmed and non-militarized, and getting caught up in the question of the relatively minor or minuscule violence is a mistake. So that would be my response to that. And what was the last question? I think, did that cover it?
Yeah, let me turn to the next few questions in the chat. First, Keith, did you have a question? Did you want to?
Feel free to beam in.
Yes, to turn your audio on, Keith.
Yeah, all right, thanks a lot. I appreciate the presentation. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate your refusal to accept kind of easy binaries and divisions in the literature, but actually following what people are really doing on the ground and trying to theorize that. I have a lot of respect for that sort of scholarship, and it was great to hear about. I do have a question or a bit of pushback on your point about both violence and horizontal organizing, though. And it stems from the fact that the sort of critiques you listed in your standard account of the objections to violence, and I think it carries through for verticality as well, were not the ones that I'm kind of used to hearing, particularly from Gandhian accounts of nonviolence, where it seemed to me like the sort of concerns you were raising were primarily like efficacy concerns, like what if it doesn't work? As where it seems to me that the Gandhian concern is really, what if it does work? What if you successfully establish a Palestinian state through violence? Do you then wind up with an inherently violent Palestinian state? It's the means ends problem, right? If you conduct the struggle through violent means, you will wind up with a violent end state. And I think that same argument carries over for verticality, that the objection I'm used to hearing is if you conduct your struggle in a vertical way, you will wind up with a vertical state. So I'm wondering what you think of that means ends problem and how it plays into the forms of kind of limited violence and verticality that you're discussing.
Thank you for that question. There's so much there that I wasn't able to touch on. I feel like I'm talking to James Tully right now. One of the things that civil resistance studies has done is it doesn't dispute the principle of nonviolence, the morality, the ethics of nonviolence, and nobody in civil resistance studies, or even myself or someone like Robin Kellikades or Palestinians, none of them would say there's anything wrong with nonviolence. Yes, that's our ideal. That is in the best case scenario. Let's strive for that perfect, absolute nonviolence, but maybe not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let maybe good enough be in some context. So there is a distinction between nonviolence as an ethical approach to struggle in life and as a practical approach. And it's true that civil resistance studies and what I'm doing is mostly looking at what works, in part because it's just one way to, we always need to define and restrict what we're looking at, and getting into whole philosophies of nonviolence is great. And obviously we want to move in that direction. But I think that by moving away from those binaries, we can see that if the Palestinians achieved a state through a military defeat of Israel, I have no doubt that, as you say, the means would become the end, and you would be reproducing a kind of new sort of violent, conventional sovereign state. But I'm not. I do think that though I'm moving away from the binary of violence and nonviolence is maybe a bit too perfect for a lot of context on the ground, I'm just shifting the goalposts a bit further back and saying there's still a distinction, but let's draw that line between militarized and non-militarized instead of violent and nonviolent, which is a little bit more vague and ambiguous, and violence and nonviolent, very loaded, contested terms, whereas militarized and non-militarized, it's very clear to most people what that means. And so, yeah, so by moving away from an emphasis on the philosophy of nonviolence, which is important and needs to be worked on and promoted, it can allow us maybe to engage with movements on the ground that maybe don't match that discourse now. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer, because I do think that violent means to achieve a goal will likely reproduce some form of violence in the end, but that what we're talking about here are such relatively minor levels of violence in the case of stone throwing against a military occupation, that I think that sort of risk or problem is probably pretty minimal. And as far as the participatory organization, I think actually a difference between my argument about action and my argument about organization is that while I do think we want to move cultures, we want to philosophize about moving towards more and more nonviolence, but I'm suggesting that the participatory model of organizing upward is actually not it's not like a compromise with authoritarianism, whereas a little bit of violence is a bit of a compromise with violence and something to be avoided. Whereas the upward structures of organization, I don't think can be demonized. They're more difficult to maintain and more difficult to organize, that kind of tiered upward participatory structure. But I think that it doesn't compromise any principles. I think if it's done properly, it's not a compromise in the way that letting a little bit of violence in through the back door is on the other side of that argument, if that makes sense.
I appreciate the distinction between those two arguments and your response in general. And just to make sure I'm following you on the violence front, to paraphrase, your position would be a little bit of violence in the means will translate to a little bit of violence in the ends, but it's just a little bit, so it's kind of acceptable.
Yes, and there's one other thing I'd like to add about that. I am a big believer in nonviolence, and I think that there are creative ways to use absolutely nonviolent methods that are every bit as forceful and proactive if you're creative about it. But you kind of don't go to war with the culture you want, you go to war with the culture you got. And I'm very weary or concerned about the optics of someone in a position of privilege in Canada and very secure life, to be in a position of saying, hey, you people facing life and death struggle, you ought to struggle this way. You ought to put those stones down. So it's a very awkward position that I try to completely avoid. And I think it's compatible with these overall theories of nonviolent civil resistance, except that it's a little bit imperfect. But the degree of imperfection is in the context is so not worth looking at. And out of respect for what movements are doing on the ground and people in situations I can't ever experience, it just, I couldn't take that position to Palestinians. It'd be like, who are you? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Michael. We'll turn back to the chat. There are two more questions. First, Eloise, and then Emmanuel. Eloise, can I ask you to turn your camera on or your mic on?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for this very interesting presentation, Michael. I have a kind of a conceptual question that actually has pretty real repercussion. I was wondering how you reconcile the idea that civil popular struggle is not always nonviolent with the notion of direct participation in hostilities under international humanitarian law. And I'm asking that question because IHL's international humanitarian law is the legal framework that applies in case of military occupation. And under that framework, civilians are not to be directly targeted by hostilities, right? But when they're considered to, for the time that they are considered to directly participate in hostilities, they can become military targets. And I'm asking the question that if by defining some actions of the popular struggle as nonviolent, does it do a favor to Israel, essentially, by opening up the possibility, by saying stone throwing can be considered nonviolent, therefore it can, if it meets the threshold of harm under HL, then while stone throwing, it is okay to directly target protesters, which I think would be a problematic conclusion. I don't know if you, I wonder if you have considered humanitarian law in your analysis, and how do you reconcile those two aspects?
Yes, well, I think that you'd be hard pressed to get away with calling all forms of Palestinian popular struggle nonviolent. It'd be great if we could say, let's just accept that stone throwing is such a minor form of violence, let's just call it nonviolent. But I don't think that's very credible. A lot of Palestinians say, no, that's not correct. And it's just the common sense position on the street would be, you can't, what kind of a crazy academic are you? You can't call that nonviolent. So what I'm suggesting is that in some contexts, we sort of move away from that language altogether. And I think that humanitarian, in philosophy and popular discourse, the binary of violent, nonviolent is very prevalent. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, in international humanitarian law, it's not. And what is the factor in international humanitarian law is whether you're a combatant or not. And this breaks down to militarized struggle or armed struggle. And so there are, the state is sort of empowered under international law to use force and deadly violence against security threats that amount to, combatants or armed armed struggle. And just one more quick point, Robin Kellikati's in his work, one of the reasons he's so insistent on moving away from emphasizing nonviolence as a criteria of civil disobedience is because in European law, there are aspects of it that allow for states to use forced security crackdowns against violent unrest, violent civil unrest. And the state is all too happy to call anything that's disruptive violence. So, oh, you block a road, that's violent, we'll send in the police. So he's saying, no, we're giving the state too much of a license to be able to label things as violent when we come in there with a mindset of nonviolence. So moving away from the language of violence and just saying, is it civilian struggle? Is it rising to the level of combatancy? No. Okay, the state has no right to crack down with deadly force. Does that get at what you're talking about?
Yeah, although unfortunately, the legal framework of international humanitarian law doesn't limit the possibility of targeting to the status of combatant. That the idea of civilian participation in hostility says that when a civilian, so it's based on the action and on the status. And so, I take very well your point that you can't, like, that calling it non-violent would not be credible, and would. So I'm just trying to see how those two aspects could be reconciled. And I guess, so what IHL would say is that when an act is likely to adversely affect the military operation or capacity of a party to the armed conflict, so in that case of the Israeli army, then it is considered to be an act of hostilities. And then if that was conducted by the civilian with the desire to have that result, then that civilian, while doing that act, can actually be directly targeted. So I'm just worried of the legal consequences of including stone throwing in the, but I understand that if you don't, then it's, so maybe the idea is to say, well, stone throwing cannot actually in any way affect the military capacity, and thus it doesn't, the civilians who are stone throwing are still protected from direct attack. But I feel like it's, yeah, I'm worried what kind of leeway could give to armed forces in just then providing them legal argument to justify their attack. Although we all know that, you know, Israel is not the most compliant with IHL to start with, but it is still kind of, I'm seeing a bit of the flip side, although I do understand the more philosophical and political ideas you're presenting.
I really appreciate this question and intervention, because it's a good reminder that this is messy stuff. There are no easy answers here. There are tensions, there are contradictions, and we're trying to work through it. But I think you're right that under international law, if military occupation is actually not illegal under international law, right? If the state has some security basis to occupy, it's not necessarily illegal, but there are certain rules of engagement, you know, Geneva Conventions, that it must apply to the occupied territory and population. And I think you're right that under those circumstances of a perceived legitimate occupation, that any civilian interference with that occupation can be deemed a military threat, which puts Palestinians in a really bad place. But so, yeah, it's very murky and complicated, and those are some great points to begin to start thinking about this in new and other important ways.
And yet there is some clarity to stone throwing, isn't there? I mean, it's not a metaphor, it's David and Goliath in that sense too, isn't it? You know, in terms of the image and the power of that image. Okay,
and let me just, sorry, Martin, can I just, one more quick thing. This is where context is so important too. I always tell my students, I'm not generalizing here. I'm not saying that stone throwing can count as civil resistance. If you're in downtown Victoria and you're protesting something and you start throwing stones at government workers or police officers, you're going to get cracked down on. And most people in the vicinity will be like, you can't throw stones. Yeah, you deserve what you get. But the context is very different. This is not a context of high repression. This is not a conflict-prone situation. But in the case of a military occupier where there are, no rights or legal avenues available to individuals, and the violence of the state and the repression is so much more disproportionate that it changes the whole dynamic. So context is important.
Thank you for that. So I'm wondering if we can squeeze 2 more questions in. Emmanuel, if you were to go first, and then Achar, I hope we have some time for your question too. Emmanuel.
Thanks so much for giving me this time. Michael, my question is in the chat box, but I mean, just how do you bring this back here in British Columbia, where we do have sometimes confrontation between the RCMP and and First Nations, for instance, on all kind of issues, and you just said that context does matter. So, what's the choice available for people who contest things sometimes? As one of your interviewees said, capitalist rules, and where the great capitalists have access to government, the ability to have a regulatory system that really serves their interest, and that average people don't have that kind of access. So how what's the range of possible answers that you would then recognize are contextually acceptable here?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure how to answer it, but maybe to say that it goes back to the importance of us as a society and as a public keeping our imaginations open, and that there is a popular misconception about protest movements, or sort of in the Gandhian, the stereotypical or simplified Gandhian image of perfect nonviolence, that for many people in the general public means non-disruptive. And so if nonviolence does carry, however incorrect it might be, a connotation of perfectly passive, civil, and non-disruptive, then when you shut down a ferry and interfere with a lot of people's days and work schedule, or you block a rail line and interfere with big industry, then people are going to say, hey, that's not nonviolence, you're being very disruptive. Well, if we can work a little bit away and imagine popular struggle as more context-based, without being fixated on simplistic notions of nonviolence, maybe a public would be a bit more ready or sympathetic to disruptive actions, and recognizing, and I think it would look at what happened. I think the Canadian public is mostly in the right place. What happened was not just an Indigenous protest movement. It was broadly supported by the Canadian public, and a lot of the boots on the ground were non-Indigenous. And I think that's because the methods seemed appropriate for the challenge. And I suspect that had things gotten violent in a way that was deadly or really explosive, you wouldn't have seen that opening for support and participation from so much of the non-Indigenous community. I feel like I've not answered your question.
Thanks so much, Michael. I know, I mean, hey, but this is, it has to be asked because it's a very important lesson. What do you do? And I think, Paul, thinking about the options is extremely important to, especially smaller groups, because I always think about the Danish answer to Nazi invasion, where the country stopped, basically. People just stayed home, right? And so when you don't have a majority of people and you're looking at small communities, how do you react? How do you bring the majority, or at least a majority, at your side to defend your cause? That becomes, the struggle of an impossible struggle, anyway, in my mind. And I'm not defending the stone throwing here. I'm just talking about, what are the contextual options that we have? That's all. I don't think it's possible to answer after your talk, but I think, it's maybe important to think about it for the future, for future research.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And for what we do at the center, the local and the global. It's such an important question that we ask on so many levels. We've run out of time, but what I wonder if I could suggest that people feel, I know people have to, some people will have to move on, but Michael, is it possible, Stephanie, is it possible that we can maybe keep the Zoom open for a little bit longer to take in another question or two? But before we do that and allow people to leave, my thanks to, of course, Michael, my thanks to all of you for participating and asking the great questions. And to Stephanie, to Jody, to Oliver, to the whole team at the Center for Global Studies for making all of this possible. Thank you to everybody.